So this week has been a very interesting week around the world, and I'm not referring to the debate that took place on Thursday night. That's not really worth spending time on a sermon, so that's not what I was referring to. What I was referring to, though, I don't know if any of you saw this, but this week started off with the first commercial flight from Manama, Bahrain to Tel Aviv, landing with a delegation from Bahrain at Ben Gurion Airport, where there in the airport, they only stayed on the ground a few hours, but there they signed many agreements to expand normalization, leading to a full diplomatic status. So very, very beautiful to watch. And as usual, and with Israeli pomp, that they put together a very beautiful ceremony. Beautiful words were spoken, and everybody was happy. And then they all loaded back in the plane, and off they went back to Manama. Good, very nice. But there were two very interesting things that came out of this by sideway that the news picked up on that nobody had any idea about. Number one, it transpires that in 2000 and, see if my memory serves me correctly here, 2010, it was 2009, either way, one of the royal princesses from the Bahraini royal household was taken ill, and she had two options. Option number one was surgery in the United States, or the other was surgery in Israel. She opted for surgery in Israel. And there was a covert mission to bring her and her immediate family members to Israel through Cyprus, where she underwent the surgery, and for the next 30 days afterwards, 30 to 40 days, they lived in Israel while she recuperated, and then off she went back to Bahrain. The story is told in the press that upon leaving, the prince, her husband, asked his host what they can do to thank Israel. And the answer came, take care of the Bahraini Jewish community. And for those of you who've been following the Bahraini Jewish community, and I have for some years, shortly after, and unbeknown to people why, but the government put a lot of money into rebuilding of the synagogue in downtown Manama. Now, of course, we know why, but we didn't know why at the time. They just did it. That was one story which was very interesting. The other story that came out, I found even more humorous and interesting, was when they were discussing, now that they've signed these agreements, they're going to have to go through the whole process of selecting embassy sites to open up an embassy, which is a big deal. You don't just open up an embassy. You have to select the building, it has to be gutted, it has to be secured, it has to be... And so when they were talking about this, the Israeli, one of the people from the Israeli delegation said, well, for us that's not going to be a problem, it's just going to be a case of changing the plaque on the door. To which people looked very perplexed at what he was talking about, and what he explained was that in 2009, when Israel decided to close its mission in Qatar, I think it was 2009, when there was this falling out between Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, maybe it was later, maybe it was a little bit later, that they closed their mission there, and with approval of the king, they set up a company called the International Development Company in Manama. Israel did, of course. And that was their unofficial embassy. And so now all we have to do is change the plaque on the door and call it the Israeli embassy in Manama, which I thought was really very, very funny. So it just shows how there is this sort of relationships that go on that people have no idea and go on for years, these warm relationships. And that's really what I want to discuss today with you, is how social discourse today is really the demonization of people who hold different opinions. Not always, but sometimes. So, with all the beautiful things that were going on with respect to Israel and its foreign policy, if you've been following the local Israeli news, you will notice that there have been incredibly large demonstrations calling for the Prime Minister Netanyahu's resignation. These demonstrations have been flooding the streets. In America, need I say too much that identity politics are on the rise? White supremacists are pitted against Black Lives Matter. There's a rise of anti-immigrant far-right parties across Europe. Here in Canada, no single party, as you know, won the 2019 election, leaving important issues such as how to cope with climate change unsettled. We seemingly regionally divided. Liberals shut out of the Alberta and Saskatchewan, Conservatives doing very poorly here in Montreal and Toronto, and Bloc Québécois rising to third place. Lots of stuff going on. Division and difficult times, such as pandemic, inevitably bring calls for unity. Israelis who are exhausted and frustrated by 3 elections in less than a year formed a unity government, which brought together Netanyahu and Gantz, the leader of the Likud and the leader of what had been the largest opposition party. The divisions in Canada, how have they been referred to? They've been referred to as what? Anybody know? National unity crisis. National unity crisis. Unity is almost universally understood as a good thing. We have the United Arab Emirates. We have the United States. We have the United Nations. United is a lot of places that wants to demonstrate the bringing together. Abraham Lincoln gave a famous speech when he said, "United we stand,
divided we fall."
Divided we fall. Or as the great American statesman Benjamin Franklin put it, we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly,
Or we will hang apart.
we will all hang separately. There you go. In this week's Torah portion, Noah. We also have an example of the power of unity. We have the story, as I said earlier, of the Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel. Even though we are familiar with the basic story, I'd like to just remind you of some of the details. If you refer to the JPS translation, they write as follows: everyone on earth had the same language and the same words, and as they migrated from the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar and settled. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them hard. Brick served them as stone, bitumen served them as mortar." And they said, "Come, let us build us a city and a tower with its top into the sky to make a name for ourselves. Else we shall be scattered all over the world." The Lord came down to look at the city and the tower that man had built. And the Lord said, "If as one people with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound their speech there, so that they shall not understand one another's speech." Thus the Lord scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because there the Lord confounded the speech of the whole earth. And from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. That's the story in a nutshell. What was it that the people were doing that got God a little upset? What did they do? They built a city together in unity. Is wanting to make a name for yourself such a bad thing? Now the Midrash understands the term "make anew for yourself," meaning as idol worship. Avodah Zarah. It's not that God felt threatened by the people. I explained that before. It's not that he cared about them or that he was threatened by them wanting to make a name for themselves, to get a reputation of accomplishment. But idol worship, in the Jewish tradition, that's one of the 3 top worst sins for which we are told there is no teshuvah. And maybe that's why God chose to confuse the language. It was like a punishment for engaging in idol worship. At the beginning of the story, it sounds like we have an ideal situation. I mean, think about it. What an ideal situation. One language throughout the entire land. Everyone got along. There was a common goal. They hated arguments. They hated fighting between people, and their relations were all peaceful. Sounds like the perfect world, right? Now Deshe, which is a 19th century commentator, asks, what kind of peace is this that leads to such a serious sin to do idol worship? He said that they were united. Can you stop? Thank you. He said that they were united by love of a thing, not by love of each other. And love of a thing is not good. It doesn't endure. It's love in the wrong direction, the wrong place. So he says that God confused the languages not to punish them, but as a test. Would the people manage to show some love for each other and find a way to continue working together, even after they had the confusion of the language barrier to deal with? And the answer, of course, in this case proves no, they didn't. The peace thus was not genuine. How many times have you heard of people who don't speak the same language somehow found a way to communicate because they had this desire to help one another? Not here. It wasn't genuine, so it all stopped. It was based on the love of a thing, and that love is shallow, and the people dispersed when it was no longer easy. There is a midrash that says, the people were so in love with a thing and had so little love for each other that if a person fell to their death while building this tower, because I'm sure they didn't have sophisticated protection like we have today, they didn't care. They just left him there. But the Midrash says if a brick fell, they would cry because it took so much effort and energy to get the bricks that high up. I'd like to suggest a different reason for the confusion of the languages. What if it wasn't a test? And what if it wasn't a punishment, but rather it was the way to lead the people to solve problems on their own? The people were united to an evil end. They were not only a single language, they were not only a single mind. There were no dissenting opinions. No one questioning what they were doing. No one arguing about the path they were going down. They were lemmings running over a cliff with no one to say, hey, turn around, you're going to go over the edge. God appreciates dissenting voices. We read this in the Torah. We see it with Abraham. We see it with Moses. God respects dissenting voices. One of the most powerful moments in the Torah is when Abraham argues with God over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. What does he say? Would you destroy the righteous with the wicked? This is Abraham. And what does Moses do? He dissents from God's plan to wipe the people out. Start over with just Moses like he did with Noah and his descendants. And he told God, if you do that, count me out. I'm not part of your plan. And God approves. God changes his opinion. Maybe what happened is God broke up the unity, and then there were some dissenting voices. Someone perhaps to say, well, wait a minute. What is it we're actually doing here? Perhaps he convinced others that idol worship was indeed a bad thing. And God didn't need to scatter the people. Why? Because they scattered themselves, having decided against going down the path of idol worship. My friends, for us to flourish as a society, we don't need false unity when no one questions anything. One of the saddest things about social discourse today is the demonization of people who hold different opinions. People on the right who think people on the left are idiots. And people on the left who think people on the right have no hearts. Political correctness runs amok in some circles, leaving people afraid to speak up and say what they really believe. In the Jewish community, we can see this most strongly around the issue of Israel. There are people who feel we shouldn't criticize Israel one iota. And there are people who define their support for Israel as meaning you can't criticize Israel, it's not our place. There are those who say that J Street is disloyal, that there's no room for those Palestinian lovers in the tent of the Jewish people. We don't need the false unity of speech control that ensures everyone thinks alike and that no one steps out of line. I once had a teacher that said, if God wanted us to think alike, he would have given us a lobotomy. That's what he would have done. The kind of unity that we need is to be unified by a great, grand, lofty goal, but then to allow dissenting opinions and listen to different voices. If you read the responsa, the teshuvot, from the Conservative Movement's Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, you can look at it on the Rabbinical Assembly website, you'll see that many of the rulings are accompanied by both dissenting opinions and concurring opinions. What is a concurring opinion? Why do you need a concurring opinion? And the reason being is that sometimes a rabbi will agree with the conclusion of a responsa, of a teshuvah, but they don't agree with the logic, or they would apply the ruling differently. And we value these different voices, even though we're unified by our love of the Jewish tradition and our desire to serve God and the Jewish people. Unity by itself is neither good nor bad. Unity brings greater strength, as it says in Ecclesiastes. Kohelet, a threefold cord is not easily broken. That strength can be applied for good, or God forbid, applied for evil. It's up to us to foster the right kind of unity, to be united in a desire to make the world a better place, even as we may disagree on what's the best way to do that. It's fun to joke that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. But the truth is that many of mankind's greatest ideas and successes are driven by committees, by groups of people working together, sharing different points of view. And perhaps the joke about the camel is not a criticism. After all, a camel is far better suited to its desert climate than a horse would ever be. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat.
Thank you.